Yo, what's up everybody? My name is Twotris, and today I wanted to ask you, where do you get your information from? So, that question was asked to me just yesterday after having a very uncomfortable conversation with a boomer, somebody born in the 1950s, somebody raised with television. And when you're raised with television, well, television sort of becomes the main source of information for basically anything happening around the world. I mean, you got to think of a boomer who must have watched television every night when they were 20, 22, when the Vietnam War was happening and all the body counts were being counted at that time. The news source was always the television. There wasn't the internet. Maybe people read the newspaper, but that was more the silent generation before them. The older generation, I've noticed, has this strange connection with the old media. And he asks me, after I tell him that I'm not entirely convinced that the political classes really have the average person in mind, that they really have the interests of the proletariat or people like you and me in mind when they're making decisions, and that really it's just BS, 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 therefore we should rule, BS, 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 therefore the thing that we did was correct. And when I said this, he seemed noticeably perturbed, and he said, "Where did you get that information from? Where do you get your information?" And I asked him the same question. Well, if you're going to make it about information or the sources of information, where do you get yours? And he said, well, I read the Washington Post, I read the New York Times, I read the Atlantic. These are reputable news sources. And notice the term reputable there. Somebody who gets their information from a reputable source is supposed to be an erudite person because they're not easily swayed by somebody who is misinformed. But who's to say that one news organization has better information than the other, in the sense that you can interpret information however you will? Let me give you a little thought experiment. Everybody talks about how you should go back in time, or if you had the power to go back in time and kill baby Hitler, would you? No. First things first, most people would not shoot a baby, and that's a conversation for a different time. But let's say you go back to Hitler when he was in his 20s, say World War I, and you were that sniper who had the chance to shoot him. I think that's a true story. Don't quote me on that, but for the sake of the hypothetical thought experiment, stay with me here. Some people would say it's absolutely a good thing to kill Hitler. And other people would say that it's not a good thing based on principle. But let's just say that it happens. The event, you see somebody die in front of you. That is an objective event, and you can't deny that somebody died. However, you can interpret the values. You can interpret the value of that action with your value system, the beliefs that you hold dear to heart. And the same thing with the news. The news can say that something happened. You can report on an event objectively. But then with a journalist or somebody interpreting that action, their narrative is pasted over that. And that narrative, at least in my opinion, from a postmodernist perspective, is not grounded in an objective reality, an objective truth, but rather it's just you are affirming your own individuality. You are affirming your own will to power whenever you do that. And any adherence to a news source is simply this emotional attachment to something that you see yourself in. And so when this boomer guy tells me that he reads the Atlantic or the New York Times, I'm tempted to ask him, well, who's to say that Fox News isn't as valid? Who's to say that the New York Post isn't giving accurate information? Clearly they're interpreting the news. Clearly they're saying that things are going on. If you screw up statistics and say that there's an objective statistics unrelated to human subjective opinion, fine, that's not what I'm talking about. But rather the way you interpret the news. Somebody could talk about global warming, for example. I'm not going to talk about my own opinion on that. I don't really care about that issue too much. But we could say it's happening. But then one person could say, well, who's to say that's not a bad thing? And another person would say, well, this is a very bad thing. And the way that you justify that, well, you can rationalize and rationalize and rationalize. Ultimately, is there really an objective truth, or are you just trying to win because this is a battle of the egos? And when I consider all of this, it really is unsettling for some people to consider the fact that there might not actually be an objective, subjective truth, and to say that your opinions are better than others specifically because they're grounded in fact, I feel is a bit narcissistic. And so I say this to him. I tell him, well, you're just using the news as a means to justify your own opinion, but you're using other subjective sources to corroborate your own subjective point of view. And he said, so you're saying that my facts are opinions? And I'm like, no. I'm not saying that your facts are opinions. I'm specifically saying that the way you interpret those facts and what you do with the objective reality is up to you. It's your viewpoint, but it's not rooted in an objective reality. And this is what pisses me off about a lot of political discourse, is people like to say that my opinions are true because they're rooted in fact. You could say that something happened, that's one thing, but you can interpret it. And the moment that you said that your interpretation is objective reality, that's when I started getting skeptical. That's when I'm like, this person is probably not going to listen to what other people think if they provide them with an equally valuable fact, but then provide their interpretation over it. Is any of this really worth it at all? This is just food for thought, of course, guys. This is one of those things that just kind of gets to me sometimes, because I'm really jaded on politics and talking about all these things. But essentially, like the boomers, the people who were raised with the news, these news sources, these reputable news sources, who's to say that a journalist who has all the proper facts isn't giving the right opinion? Who's to say that some YouTuber or some other very independent journalist who starts his own website isn't correct? They could do the fact checks if they want. I mean, we know that people are known to lie. We know that news organizations are known to lie. And I think that ultimately there's no one news source that's going to give you all the information. But the end of the day, I can't help but think that a lot of what you believe is just your own interpretation. And as much of a cop-out as that kind of sounds, it sort of checks out for me, which is another reason that just political discourse for me is a lot of fun, because I just do a lot of listening. I'm like, really, this is how this person thinks. This is their expression of opinion. This is what is fundamentally ingrained in their heart, but it's not necessarily an objective truth. Unless you're religious, in which case I guess you do believe in objective truth. And if that's how you feel, fine. That is a totally different conversation that I would like to have at a different time. But all that to say is, when it comes to news sources, relying on them specifically because you think that it justifies your opinion, I think is a cop-out. A thing can actually happen in reality, but the moral judgment that happens, that's just a debate, man. And whoever wins the debate, I mean, you got to use tactics. You got to use very sly techniques to convince people of your perception. But it's just a big, muddy puddle of human subjective interpretation. And that's what kind of got me, I wouldn't say uncomfortable, but just, jaded with that conversation yesterday. And the guy looks at me and he's like, your worldview is very dangerous. And I ask him why. Well, he says, your worldview is dangerous because it can allow the justification for absolutely everything. And that's very postmodern of him to say. But in the same breath, is that not what he's doing right now? You and I are participating in the same game. I just feel like I'm more honest about this game. And maybe you haven't really realized it. But who knows? If we're going to be postmodern here, everything that I'm saying doesn't really mean anything at all. Kind of see what I'm saying? I don't know. I don't want to call myself a postmodernist, but these are the weird, strange, little ideological rabbit holes that I find myself crawling down, and then maybe a year later I'll be like, wait a second, I was an idiot. All that was wrong. I shouldn't have thought any of that. And I'll go through some other ideological transformation, just as all of you guys are doing throughout your lives. But who knows? I just wanted to get this off my chest today because it's interesting. But I'm not saying that I'm right. Just sharing my opinion. What do you think?